Several years ago, after many years of talking about it and dreaming about it, I was given a green light by the church council to plan and develop what we now know as the Dugout. The Dugout is our marvelous youth ministry facility underneath Peterson Hall. I'm surprised every once in a while to run into folks who still don't know about its existence, and I would encourage you to check it out. We had no plans to borrow the estimated $160,000 to $170,000 cost of the project. We had no plans to do a capital campaign, but I was given permission to write one letter to the congregation, one letter, inviting all members to consider giving a one-time gift above and beyond their normal financial commitment or tithe towards this special project. I suggested that if anyone had ever been in one of our youth groups, if any of you had had a child or a grandchild in one of our youth groups, if any of you anticipated having a child or a grandchild in one of our youth groups, or if you had ever been a child, that you might find a way to support this badly needed project. We gave periodic progress reports in the church newsletter, celebrating gifts of every size. Much sweat equity was invested by volunteers organized by Dave Festerling and Lee Lawrenson almost every weekend, hundreds and hundreds of volunteer hours by men, women, and youth who shared the dream of this being a new youth facility. After one weekend newsletter article where Dave had asked for a team of volunteers for the following weekend, one older gentleman from our congregation, now deceased, called me in the church office and asked how much we still needed to raise to complete the project. We had crossed over the $100,000 mark already, so I said that we still needed approximately $55,000 to $56,000. His response, well, I'm too old to do the work that I'm seeing called for in the newsletter articles, so I can't volunteer to work on those weekend projects, but I can still write checks. He said, would it be okay if I gave you a check for that balance? Oh, no, I didn't say that. After I restarted my heart, caught my breath, dried a few tears that he couldn't see, I told him that it would most certainly be okay. Less than an hour later, he walked into my office, sat down in front of my desk, and wrote out a check to Ascension Lutheran Church for about $56,000. I told him that his check, combined with all of the other checks, large and small, that had come in, would be a blessing for children, youth, and families for generations to come. He said that God had already blessed him so very much, and that it gave him great joy to be able to give the gift. And if you've been paying attention, it's the very same process we use to pay cash for that new bus sitting out in the parking lot. This man's mindset wasn't, oh, now I have $55,000 less than I had before in my bank account. Instead, his attitude was, I have been so blessed to have the ability to give it, and I'm now even more blessed to be able to give it to you. This weekend begins our annual stewardship campaign, our Joy of Giving campaign. Pastor Steve and the Finance Committee have chosen the theme, The Paradox of Generosity. There should be a wonderful visual right about here prepared by them. It's based on the Bible verse, it's more blessed to give than to receive. The gentleman that I described understood that verse. And the Bible verse itself is a paradox, hence the title. And what is a paradox? Well, I've returned to an old friend, Webster's Dictionary. This was actually the one with hard covers on it. And this is what Webster's had to say about paradox. A paradox is a statement that seems contradictory, absurd, but may be true in fact. Or, a paradox is a statement that is self-contradictory. Or, a paradox is a person or thing seemingly inconsistent and full of contradictions. Our three Bible references, Kim read the first two and I read the Gospel. The three Bible lessons for today each contain what I think might well be described as a paradox. In our Gospel lesson from Luke, this is a post-resurrection appearance by Jesus to the 11. Of course, Judas was no longer in the mix, and he taught the 11 that it was necessary for the Messiah to die, but then to rise from the dead. For the average human, that's contradictory. It's a paradox. He says to suffer and die, but then to rise from the dead. Unprecedented. In our second lesson from 1 John, we read, "We should be called children of God, for that is what we are. What we shall be has not yet been revealed." And at that point, I want to ask, but wait, wasn't I told in my baptism that I'm a child of God forever? How can I be anything but that? In our first lesson from the book of Acts, when Pilate is being pressed, you know the story on Good Friday, when Pilate's being pressured to have Jesus crucified for blasphemy or because he's a threat to the Roman Empire somehow. Pilate, just wanting to avoid doing that, offers the church a choice then, the people gathered, a choice to release a prisoner. That was an annual tradition. So he made it seemingly such an obvious choice. You can release Jesus, or you can release Barabbas, the murderer. Well, you know the story. The crowd, the biblical text says it beautifully. The crowd rejected the holy and righteous one. They killed the author of life, and they voted to free the murderer, Barabbas. Truly a paradox, truly something absurdly contradictory. And as Peter reflects with those 11 on the very bad choice made by the angry crowd on Good Friday, he chalks it off to ignorance, and he calls the people to repentance. Well, we live today as Easter people. It's the third Sunday of Easter. We no longer can claim ignorance in our decision-making process. With all of the communication that we have access to, we know the story. No longer ignorant, we're witnesses to the life-giving resurrection of Jesus Christ through the Scriptures and through generations of faithful witnesses who have gone before us. Generation after generation after generation, passing on the story to us today, with God now counting on us to keep the story alive. We live as loved, forgiven children of God. So then what is required of us as Easter people?